intelligence, or AI. When I first came to Ghana over 30 years ago, I found a verdant landscape along Ghana's Atlantic coast and immediately fell in love with the culture. I was especially drawn to the traditional textile practices, the weaving, the dyeing, the craftsmanship, and the relationship people had to materials, repair and reuse. Clothing was not simply consumed. It carried identity, memory, skill, and community. At that time, I had just left the fast-paced consumer culture of the United States behind. I was searching for a different understanding of what it means to live well. In Kokravite, small village, I encountered systems of exchange and ways of living that were rooted in balance, stewardship, and interdependence. People used what they had carefully. Things were repaired, materials stayed in circulation, knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. Looking back now, I also recognize that I was seeing this place partly through a diasporic lens. I had romanticized certain aspects of village life because I had already experienced the exhaustion of overconsumption. But many people in these communities did not see themselves as living in a utopia. They wanted opportunity. They wanted investment, infrastructure, mobility, and access to the modern world, and over time, that development began to appear. But it came with consequences. Consequences few people fully anticipated. Slowly, I watched local textile traditions begin to fade beneath the growing flood of imported secondhand clothing. The markets became saturated with garments arriving from the global north. Initially, these clothes represented affordability and access. But over time, I noticed something deeper was happening. I remember one moment clearly. I saw a young man wearing a T-shirt with a Confederate flag on it, and the words were, "The South will rise again." And I realized he likely had no idea what those words meant. That moment stayed with me because it revealed the extraordinary disconnect built into the global secondhand clothing system. Products, symbols, histories, and eventually waste were traveling across the world completely detached from their context. Ghana had become responsible not only for recirculating clothing, but increasingly for managing the waste and excess of global fashion industry it did not control. And that is why conversations like the one we're having at this summit are so deeply important. How did we get here? The truth is, this crisis did not begin in Ghana. It emerged over decades through a global economic system that positioned many African countries primarily as receivers of finished foreign goods rather than producers of high-value manufactured products. As trade barriers fell, and global things were repaired, consumption accelerated. Countries like Ghana became increasingly integrated into a textile economy shaped elsewhere. At the time, the rise of fast fashion dramatically increased the volume of clothing being produced and discarded around the world. Garments became cheaper, trends moved faster, and clothing itself increasingly became disposable. Much of the excess eventually traveled downstream. Some of it is donations, some is secondhand clothing, some is reusable goods, but over time, growing volumes of low-quality surplus and near waste also entered the system. And yet, while the value generated across the global fashion chain was distributed internationally, the environmental and infrastructural burden accumulated locally. Our markets, our beaches, our drainage systems, and our communities became responsible for absorbing the consequences of a global culture of overproduction. Because if the global model remains one of endless overproduction in one part of the world and endless absorption in another, then we have not solved the underlying imbalance. We have only made it more efficient, as I think we are prepared to acknowledge Africa cannot become the permanent endpoint of global excess. A truly sustainable future must also include reduction in overproduction, reduction in disposable consumption, and a rejection of the notion that the environmental cost of the global economy can simply be exported elsewhere. So, shared responsibility must mean more than simply acknowledging the problem. It must include investment in African manufacturing, investment in manufacturing capacity, technology transfer, skills development, and infrastructure that allows African countries not only to recycle materials, but to shape value chains themselves. Because as African economies continue to grow and industrialize, we too will face increasing questions around production, consumption, and waste. This means we have a rare opportunity to not simply repeat the extractive industrial models of the past, but to design new systems that are more balanced, regenerative, and sustainable from the beginning. And perhaps this is where Africa has something profound to contribute to the world. For a long time, many of the ideas we now describe as innovation, sustainability, or circularity already existed within African knowledge systems, long before the term circular economy became popular. Communities across this continent understood the importance of durability, stewardship, repair, and interdependence. People built with local materials, adapted to their environment, objects were reused and repurposed, skills were passed from one generation to the next, waste was minimized because resources were understood to be, and this is important, rational, valuable, and finite. This is what I mean when I speak about another form of AI, or African intelligence. The accumulated intelligence of generations, knowledge shaped through observation, adaptation, community, memory, and lived experience. Knowledge systems that evolved over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years in relationship with specific climates, ecosystems, materials, and social realities. At the Institute, this understanding became the foundation of our work. When we saw traditional textile practices disappearing beneath the flood of imported secondhand clothing, we did not simply ask how to reject globalization. We asked how to transform what already existed into something more regenerative and culturally rooted. That question led to our upcycling initiatives. We began working with discarded secondhand garments, combining them with traditional African dyeing techniques, natural fibers, weaving and design practices. Materials that had not lost value within one system were reimagined through another. Waste became a resource for creativity, entrepreneurship, and cultural continuity. But more importantly, the work reminded us that sustainability is not only about infrastructure or technology. It is also about world view. It's about how societies define their values, how we relate to materials, how we balance consumption with responsibility, and whether development is measured only by how much we produce or also by how wisely we sustain what we already have. Because ultimately, the future we're discussing here is not only a matter of the environment. It's a matter of culture. And perhaps that is the larger opportunity before us today. Not simply to build better systems for managing waste, but to rethink our relationship to value and values. And perhaps we must ask ourselves a deeper question. What does it truly mean for Ghana and for Africa to become a leading downstream voice? Because there's a very important difference between having a voice downstream and being defined by a downstream position in the global economy. For too long, downstream nations have been left to absorb the environmental burden, the disposable cost, and the excess of systems designed elsewhere. So, yes, Ghana must continue to lead the global conversation on accountability, sustainability, and recovery, but our long-term ambition cannot simply be to become more efficient at managing the waste of others. Our collective ambition must be greater than that. It must be to move further upstream into manufacturing, innovation, design, material science, technology, and the shaping of sustainable systems themselves. Systems inspired by traditional social values that were committed to protecting living things, our environment, and those who inhabit it. And this is where true partnership and shared responsibility become essential. Africa does not lack creativity. Africa does not lack intelligence, and it does not lack solutions. What Africa has too often lacked is equal access to the conversations that impact future development, control investment, and shape the values that drive the technological advancements needed to build global systems on equal terms. And yet, despite the communities across the continent they've continued to innovate with extraordinary resilience. That resilience deserves more than admiration. It deserves partnership. And it deserves a future in which African countries are not merely viewed as the final destination of global consumption, but as equal architects in shaping a new culture around the industry itself. With that said, we cannot proceed with business as usual, with old models. And I know it's difficult to imagine that it's possible to adopt values, new values, that are more environmentally sustainable, economically balanced, and at the end of the day, more humane. It takes courage to be the voices of our time to assert that the world is not flat. It's big and round and teeming with people. For too long, downstream have been left to absorb. Oh my God. Sorry. There you go. So let me get back to the punch. Okay, so all of what we need to do, and I said that we have to be able to imagine that there's a new way to do business, that we cannot proceed as business as usual. And I think I said we have to be the people in this generation that says the world is not flat. It's full and round and full of people, all of whom deserve the right to a dignified life. And with that mandate, it's clear to me there's a lot of work to be done. And there's no better place to start than here. And let me just echo an old industry term. So let's just do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame Renee Neblett. Thank you for those important reflections. We now understand why this particular summit exists and why downstream evidence must lead in this particular conversation. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of some very important persons in our midst. The first person I'd like to acknowledge is Honorable Joyce Bawa Mokhtari. She is the board chair for Landfills to Landmarks. She's also the special aide to the president currently, President John Dramani Mahama. Ma'am, you're so much welcome. I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of Helen Nellis, retired Lord Lieutenant of Bedfordshire and patron of Keach Hospital. If you're here, can we get a wave, sir? You're welcome, ma'am. You're welcome. We'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Belle Ribeiro Adi, who is the Member of Parliament for Clapham and Brixton Hill in the United Kingdom. If you're here, sir, can we see you? Okay, I think he's on his way. He's coming. We'd like to acknowledge the presence of Justice Sir Dennis Dominic Eje. He is a Justice of the Supreme Court of Ghana and a Judge of the African Court of Human and People's Rights. Sir, if you're here, can we get a wave, please? Okay, he's also on his way. He'll be here shortly. Honorable Thomas Nyako Apim is the Deputy Minister of Finance, Ghana. Sir, you're so much welcome. Can we get a wave, please, from you, sir? You're so much welcome, sir. Michael Oye is Chief Executive Officer for Textile Recycling International, TRI. You are so much welcome here. Owen Ritchie, the Managing Director of Clyde Recycling. We also have Jonathan Side, Managing Director for Side Recycling. We also have representatives from Tradeway Shipping Limited, Samantha and Emma. If you're here, can we see a wave? Right, you're welcome. We also have the president for GUTA, Clement Boateng. Clement Boateng, if you are here, can we get a wave, please? You're so much welcome, sir. We'd like to acknowledge the presence of some policymakers from the Ministry of Local Government. Ministry of Local Government, if you're here, can we get a wave? All right, you're welcome. Ministry of Trade, Agribusiness and Industry. If you're here, can we also get, you're welcome, ma'am. And finally, from the Environmental Protection Authority and also the Ghana Standards Authority, if you're here, can we see you, please? You're so much welcome. Now, we're moving on, and we're going to ask a very big question. How do public systems and infrastructure support responsible textile recovery in this practice? And to deliver this particular policy keynote on responsible waste management infrastructure and public systems, ladies and gentlemen, with a round of applause, join me welcome the Deputy Minister for Finance, Honorable Thomas Nyako Ampem. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Permit me to recognize all of you by referring to you as ladies and gentlemen. And to say a very big thank you to my sister-in-law, Honorable Joyce Bawa, for giving me the opportunity to come and interact with such wonderful audience. Let me say that I appreciate the opportunity that these organizers have given us. The Landfills to Landmarks Summit 2026, for convening this timely and important platform. The theme, Trace, Account, Rebuild, speaks directly to a defining challenge of our time: how nations build systems that can sustain economic growth while managing environmental responsibility, market accountability, and long-term public value. Across the world, the rules governing trade, production, and material recovery are changing rapidly. Markets increasingly demand traceability, environmental compliance, supply chain transparency, and measurable standards across the full life cycle of products and materials. These developments are not distant global trends with limited relevance to Ghana. They are already reshaping the environment within which our industries, markets, cities, and institutions must operate. The implications are profound. Countries that are unable to track economic activity manage end-of-life systems, and build accountable recovery infrastructure will increasingly struggle to remain competitive within the emerging global economy. This summit, therefore, is not simply an environmental conversation. It is fundamentally an economic transformation conversation. It is about how Ghana positions itself within the future architecture of trade, industrialization, and sustainable growth. Ladies and gentlemen, every day across Ghana, millions of people participate in highly productive economic activity: trading, transporting, repairing, recycling, designing, manufacturing, and creating value within markets that sustain livelihoods and entire communities. Yet, a significant proportion of this activity remains outside structured visibility systems, invisible to data, difficult to track, difficult to finance, and often difficult to integrate into long-term national planning. The challenge, therefore, before us is not informality itself. Informality has long been part of the resilience and entrepreneurial character of African economies. The real challenge is invisibility. Because when economic activities cannot be properly tracked, governments struggle to plan effectively. Revenue leakages increase, standards enforcement weakens, financing gaps persist, and opportunities for growth become constrained. In today's economy, visibility has become an economic asset. Data has become infrastructure, and traceability has become a prerequisite for competitiveness. That is why the work being championed by Landfills to Landmarks is both timely and strategic. What this initiative seeks to advance goes beyond waste management or textile recovery alone. It seeks to establish systems that improve accountability, strengthen recovery pathways, support livelihoods, reduce public costs, and create measurable economic value. Importantly, it also recognizes a critical principle that formalization should not be approached as punishment or exclusion. Properly designed formalization becomes empowerment. It extends opportunities, improves access to financing, strengthens market confidence, and enhances long-term economic participation. Ladies and gentlemen, textiles sit at the center of this discussion because the secondary textile economy intersects with trade, affordability, employment, environmental protection, local government administration, logistics, standards regulations, and public finance. The global second-hand apparel market is projected to exceed $350 billion in the coming years. This is driven largely by sustainability concerns and circular economic models. Here in Ghana, Kantamanto alone supports tens of thousands of livelihoods. They are traders, tailors, recyclers, transporters, upcyclers, designers, and exporters. However, the broader issue extends beyond textiles alone. Plastics, electronic waste, organic waste, construction waste, and other material streams each require different recovery systems, different financing models, and different infrastructure responses. Each material stream carries economic value when properly managed, but each also poses substantial public costs when systems are absent. The policy challenge before governments, therefore, is straightforward. How do we design systems capable of recovering value before residual materials become unmanaged burdens on cities, assemblies, and public finances? The global circular economy discussion has increasingly arrived at one central conclusion, and that is sustainability requires infrastructure. Without sorting systems, collection networks, recovery facilities, recycling capacity, data architecture, and functioning secondary markets, circularity remains an aspiration rather than an operational economic system. This is why the conversation we are having today must be understood primarily as an infrastructure and financing conversation. For the Ministry of Finance, the central issue is how Ghana structures financing mechanisms and delivery models capable of supporting responsible recovery systems at scale. The country requires investable frameworks that can mobilize public capital, private capital, and development financing towards measurable outcomes. We require systems that support segregation, collection, recycling, recovery, and environmental accountability, while also protecting livelihoods and encouraging enterprise growth. Ladies and gentlemen, the discussion also comes at an important national moment. Ghana currently has made significant progress in restoring macroeconomic stability and rebuilding investor confidence through disciplined fiscal reforms and institutional strengthening. Recent improvements in Ghana's credit outlook and renewed confidence from international partners reflect the difficult but necessary work being undertaken to restore resilience and credibility within the economy. However, macroeconomic recovery alone is not sufficient. Economic growth must become more traceable. Trade systems must become more accountable, and development outcomes must become more inclusive and measurable. Because sustainable prosperity demands not only on growth itself, but on the quality of systems that support growth. Ladies and gentlemen, what is particularly encouraging about this summit is its practical orientation. Too often, discussions around sustainability remain theoretical, but transformation ultimately occurs through implementation. The practical demonstrations, market engagement, and technical discussions connected to this summit illustrate both the scale of the challenge and the scale of the opportunity before Ghana. If Ghana succeeds in developing practical systems that improve traceability, revenue visibility, standards compliance, environmental accountability, and recovery financing, then Ghana can position itself as a continental leader within the emerging circular economy landscape. This opportunity becomes even more significant within the framework of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The future competitiveness of African economies will increasingly depend not only on production capacity, but also on supply chain integrity, certification systems, sustainability standards, and verifiable compliance frameworks. Africa, therefore, has a unique opportunity to embed traceability, accountability, and sustainability into its industrial and trade systems from the outset, rather than attempting costly retroactive adjustments in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, responsible recovery infrastructure must also be viewed as an industrial opportunity. Sorting centers, recycling facilities, repair hubs, digital tracking systems, recovery enterprises, and circular manufacturing platforms all represent opportunities for investment, employment creation, skills development, and enterprise growth. Properly structured recovery systems create opportunity and economic value while simultaneously reducing pressure on public infrastructure and improving environmental outcomes. Government therefore remains committed to working with credible partners who bring serious implementation capacity, strong governance frameworks, measurable outcomes, and long-term commitment to Ghana's development priorities. Effective delivery will require coordinated partnership between government, local authorities, development institutions, private investors, market actors, and research institutions. Public institutions must provide regulatory coordination, policy direction, and accountability frameworks. Private capital must support scalable and bankable projects. Assemblies and local authorities must remain central to operational delivery, and research and technical institutions must continue to strengthen standards, verification systems, and capacity development. Ladies and gentlemen, history shows clearly that the strongest economies were not built solely through resource extraction or increased consumption. They were built through systems that create visibility, systems that build confidence, systems that strengthen accountability, and systems that transform economic activity into sustainable national development. That is the opportunity before Ghana today, to move from fragmented systems to integrated ones, from invisible trade to traceable commerce, from unmanaged waste to recoverable value, and from informality without structure to inclusive growth supported by accountability and opportunity. The work being advanced by landfills to landmarks is therefore environmentally relevant. It is economically strategic. It is institutionally important, and it speaks directly to the future direction of African development. Let us therefore be bold enough to lead, bold enough to innovate, and bold enough to build systems together that future generations will inherit with confidence and with pride. I commend the organizers, development partners, market leaders, technical experts, public institutions, and all stakeholders contributing to this important national conversation. The Ministry of Finance looks forward to continued engagement on financing pathways for responsible recovery infrastructure, textile recovery systems, and sustainable end-of-life management in Ghana. I thank you and wish the summit every success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Once more, we are reminded why we are here this particular morning. And most of the time, infrastructure conversations often sound very, very technical until you realize the kind of damage that it causes to our drainage systems and the entire communities. But I'd like to remind you once more that you should keep your eyes on the screens, because we'll be having a QR code here. We want to hear from you, want to hear your comments, your questions, and any other thing you want to say on this particular account day. Before we continue in this morning's policy and governance sessions, we would want to take a brief cultural interlude, which will be presented by Steve's Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Steve's Africa.
Each week, 15 million of the Obroniwe finds itself along the docks of the global south. Each week, the coastal towns and their shores and their seas and their fish and the humans groan and moan under the weight of foreign ghosts. When did it get stuck in time? This one swallowed machine of our name, and why have we not realized its rust? Somewhere, a dead man's denim lends the shape and sway of the Ghanaian hips. Somewhere, right here, a fisherman untangles fabric from the lungs of dying fish, and another nation cleanses its conscience by shipping Jamestown its forgetting. But Jamestown, old farmer and the dens who doubt, do not have the luxury of forgetting, you see. The rivers can no longer speak, you see. Their mouths have been struck dumb by polyester prayers. They say that fine cloth hides many scars. Tell me, what does it mean to set for identity inside another man's collar? To zip oneself inside an alien dream? I too would like to be proud to share in my batik that clings to my figure eight. I too would that my culture was much home produced and my lives did not have to choke under imported bills heavier than coffins. I too would that I'd wear my Ankara in a dinkra with pride. Surely the coastline skin and the gold congregation and the men baptized in salt would thank me. Surely even the smoke-stained sky would thank me. My ancestors would thank me. For it is not just the shores and the seas and the wetlands that carry this cross of oppression, you see. Even we have become foreign climates of ourselves.
Is the benefit. The bitter sting of cyanide getting into the veins of unborn children, twisting their limbs like branches struck by lightning. Can you hear the rivers choking, spitting up fish with bellies bloated like the lies we swallowed whole? Can you feel the soil trembling under the weight of your avarice? Do you not see the benefit? Ask the fishermen and they will tell you how their nets struck up ghosts. Ask the Jamestown men what it means when a coastline forgets its own sands, when their houses are uprooted, compressed into tighter spaces. I woke up in a body that was no longer mine. Strange hands groping skin, aliens panting, brawling. There was no one to defend who. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, I came and you were not home. am the keeper. I remember every name, every will, every river, every wound pressed into my flesh. Wounds become whispers and fractures have made rivers. Grief became seeds waiting to bloom, and still I rise, steadfast as the tide, unyielding as the sun, and every stolen acre, every crushed voice, every shadowed home is tomorrow of return, and I wait, patient, yes, relentless, but what was thinking will root again. What was broken will grow stronger, and the scars will find their way.
can all agree with me that that was quite a wonderful performance. Another round of applause for them, please. I wish I could move my body like that, you know. How many of us can move our bodies like that? Okay, I see you. Anyways, good morning once again. Welcome to Accounts Day at the Landfills Landmarks Summit 2026 here at the LABADI Beach Hotel in Accra, Ghana. My name is Christabel Success Treve. I'm a broadcast journalist with TV3. I'm also a professional compere, as you would call it, a professional corporate MC. And I'm so excited to be guiding us through today's conversations under the theme, Trace, Account, and Rebuild. This morning we'll continue our important conversations on examining the standards and also on accountability. So whether you're joining us now or you joined us from the time we started, you are right on time because we're going to be having solution-focused conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to welcome somebody now who I personally admire. I got the chance to, the first time I met her was on a stage like this on the University of Ghana campus, where I got to moderate an event like this, a women's conference actually, and I must say her personality is one of a kind. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to welcome the board chair of the Landfills Landmarks, Presidential Advisor and Special Aide to His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama, Honorable Joyce Bawa Mokhtari. Now her address would serve as Ghana's senior tone-setting moment on downstream regulation, evidence discipline, and accountable leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Madam Joyce Bawa. You're welcome.
Good morning, everybody. And I believe I'll stand on the existing protocols. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know whether it is the conversations beginning from the best-dressed gentleman on campus years ago and boldly telling us that the outfits he had on that morning were all from Kant. For short, it is Kantamanto. So if you met a well-dressed journalist, a well-dressed student, from probably about 20 odd years ago, most of them will tell you that the full apparel is from Kantamanto. The question we should all be asking is, as we speak about trace, account, and what have you, is that what happens to all the other outfits that no fine gentleman or lady wanted to wear? What happened to all the ones that probably lost luster and no longer fashionable? What did they do with all of these things? And it's quite interesting that someone has actually thought it wise to start a conversation now about how we can improve on what we do with all this fabric, this material. And for us here in Ghana, in Africa in particular, we do know that these things have now become a huge challenge, what to do with them. So for everybody who is into recycling, who is into climate, who is into sustainable conversations, I'm sure you know that this is actually a very, very important conversation. So delighted to be here with you this morning and honored that this morning I stand here before all of you as a chairperson of this fantastic initiative, Landfills to Landmarks, to give you a very formal opening address. So without further ado, let me say, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all of you who have joined us here from far and near this morning, on behalf of His Excellency the President John Dramani Mahama, I bring you felicitations today and always. And I speak on behalf of the Board of Landfills to Landmarks and welcome you all to this very formal opening of this all-important summit. I extend my appreciation to the Environmental Protection Authority, the Ghana Standards Authority, the Ministry of Trade and Agribusiness, the Ministry responsible for local government, chieftaincy and religious affairs, the Ghana Revenue Authority, Customs Division, the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, and all public institutions that have made it an effort to be here with us this morning. I also recognize the trades associations, most of whom I used to work with years ago, importers, exporters, wholesalers, retailers, KIA leaders, and market workers, recovery actors, waste managers, researchers, investors, brands, and of course all the exporters who are here today. the charity retail networks, those who sort through all of this, the recyclers, media houses, development partners, all of you who have joined this national and international conversation, we welcome you all to our beautiful city of Ghana, specifically to Greater Accra region. The significance of this gathering lies in the fact that the full chain has entered one room. People who ship, those who inspect, those who buy, those who carry, those who sort, those who regulate, those who fund and finance, those who also live with the consequences of this trade are definitely no longer speaking separately, but coming together to speak together on this very important conversation. I believe that Accra has given this conversation this amazing platform. Matters such as this are matters that I believe that everybody who has a future at heart believes in. For many years, this trade has supplied all the affordable clothing. I can't say that enough. It has supported various enterprises, connected households, charities, exporters, importers, traders, cities across continents. It is an economic value chain that actually deserves our respect. Its contributions to welfare of households, to livelihoods, and of course in our part of the world where poverty is actually a big deal and employment a big challenge, this has actually become a way that people try to improve upon their livelihoods. When we talk about this concern, I believe that it starts when the quality fails, where documentation is weak, where traceability is literally absent, and where materials that ought to have been managed earlier arrive as a cost to markets and cities such as ours. A good bail creates value. A failed bail indeed creates loss. That loss is felt by the importer who paid for unsuitable goods, unusable goods, the trader whose working capital is trapped, the market worker whose daily income is affected, the assembly that manages the waste pressure, and the citizen who sees drains, beaches, and all public spaces carrying the evidence of a system that has not been properly governed. The cost may indeed appear local. Its origin often sits across a much wider chain. For that reason, the conversation taking place here is larger than second-hand clothing. It is about the terms of responsible trade. It is about the discipline of standards. It is also about the protection of markets. It is about the future of sanitation. It is also about the whether or not the global circular economy is prepared to account for the places where products reach their final consequences. Ghana supports legitimate trade. For many families, we depend on this economy. Many businesses have grown through it. Many people are clothed through it. That reality should never be treated casually. At the same time, legitimate trade cannot become a cover for weak grading, poor quality control, and managed residues or silent cost transfer. The country's position should be understood in that balance. We welcome trade that is honest, useful, and fit for purpose. We welcome partners who respect the market and the people who keep it working. We welcome investment that builds capacity, protects livelihoods, and strengthens national systems. What should no longer be accepted is a model where value moves across borders and the cost of failure is left for traders, assemblies, communities, and future generations. How do we access this across the world? How do we actually create policy that will actually start to shift the way we see these things? Exporting jurisdictions are tightening their rules, and I've seen a few of you here around this table. Sorting producer responsibility, product design, and unsold stock. These reforms matter because the old model of producing, consuming, discarding, and transferring consequences has reached its limit. Yet upstream reform will remain incomplete until receiving countries help define the evidence, standards, and recovery systems that are required on the ground. A rule written in an exporting market cannot be judged by intention alone. Its true effect is seen when goods arrive in Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Cotonou, Abidjan, and other receiving markets across the continent. That is where the quality is tested. That is where documentation is proven. That is where responsibility either becomes visible or disappears. As the summit begins, Downstream actors are not being invited merely to attend. They are being invited to shape the record. Traders will explain where value is created and where loss occurs. Market leaders will describe the city and, of course, commercial risks that are associated with this trade. Public institutions will set out the need for standards, inspection, data, and enforcement. International partners will hear directly from those who manage the consequences after shipments. That record should shape the workload and, of course, should determine the work ahead. The public story around second-hand clothing has often been too narrow. A market is photographed, while the trading system behind it remains unseen. Waste is shown, while the journey of that material is rarely traced. A breach or beach or drain becomes the image that travels, while underfunded recovery, weak standards enforcement, and cross-border cost transfer receive less attention. Such framing does not in any way solve the problem. Outrage does not finance recovery of infrastructure. It does not protect a trader from poor quality. It does not give standards officers the tools to test what enters the market. It does not help city authorities prevent textile residues from reaching drains. It does not provide customs officers with better data. It does not create a fair remedy when a consignment fails. Ghana indeed has a deeper task: to clean up campaigns and to clean up all that remains valuable. We mobilize our citizens, we restore public spaces, and support national sanitation efforts. Assemblies, communities, volunteers, and public institutions deserve recognition for that work. Yet cleaning after damage has occurred cannot be permanent because the architecture of textile management is totally different. Significant resources have gone into waste removal, public campaigns, emergency responses, and community interventions. Those efforts matter. The problem persists because the source of the pressure has not been addressed as is required. Materials still enter the system without adequate visibility. Poor quality still creates avoidable loss. End-of-life routes remain underfunded. Local authorities still absorb costs, and of course, all the costs that are created across are no longer within that international chain. A nation cannot build a serious sanitation future around repeated cleanups alone. Prevention has to move higher in policy, in investment, and trade governance. Materials requiring the country or those entering the country should be visible. Quality should be tested before commercial loss reaches the market. Standards ought to define what is acceptable. Documentation should match the goods. Recovery routes should be financed. Local authorities should not be left to carry costs created far beyond their borders. That is the practical meaning of shared responsibility. Exporters and sorters have obligations before shipment. Brands and retailers ought to recognize that fiber choices, durability, labeling, and product quality have consequences beyond the first buyer. Importers and traders need systems that protect the market and strengthen confidence. Regulators and standards bodies require authority. Tools and information are also required to act. Development partners and investment should help build infrastructure that prevents damage rather than funding responses after damage has already occurred. Exporting and receiving countries need a common language for quality. Standards bodies and technical alignment institutions need also a policy. Customs and inspection systems need better information. Brands and retailers need downstream visibility. Investors need bankable recovery projects. Development partners need to support systems that strengthen national capacity rather than adding another short cycle of intervention. The government of Ghana is already working across sanitation, environmental protection, trade governance, local economic development, market upgrading, standards enforcement, and industry renewal. Textile end-of-life management touches every one of those priorities. We will end up with a blocked drain that is not only an environmental concern, a rejected bill that becomes a trader's loss and, of course, more damage to the environment, and unmanaged disposable sites that is not only a local government burden, but, of course, an environmental burden as well. Each of these points to a wider system requiring better rules, more finance, better information, and stronger coordination. The work before us should actually support government's efforts. It should help public institutions move from reaction to prevention. It should strengthen Ghana's ability to protect markets, cities, workers, households, and future generations. The private sector also has a major role. Recovery facilities, sorting centers, textile recycling, repair systems, fiber recovery, market logistics, and data platforms can become areas of enterprise, employment, and industrial growth. Ghana should not carry the burden of textile residues without building the capacities, businesses, and jobs that come from managing materials properly. Trace means knowing what enters the market, where materials move, where value remains, and what burden all these fabrics create. Account also means assigning responsibility when quality fails, when documentation is weak, when recovery costs arise, and when public systems are placed under pressure. To rebuild also means investing in the infrastructure, standards, data systems, inspection capacity, and recovery routes that make responsible trade possible. The technical sessions, market engagements, and live assessment work across the summit have value because they move the discussion away from opinion, away from perspective, and of course, they assess when goods are actually in the actual market. The room begins to see the relationship between declared quality and commercial results. When downstream information is recorded, the conversation gains a record. When traders, regulators, and partners examine the same information, trust indeed has a foundation. The purpose is to build a system capable of supporting standards, protecting buyers, guiding investment, informing policy, and strengthening accountability. A market is not protected by goodwill alone. A city is not protected by sympathy. A trader is not protected by a promise without remedy. A government is not supported by partnership that stops at applause. The work starting here should leave behind ownership, timelines, and follow through. Exporters ought to commit to quality, documentation, and remedy. Brands and retailers ought to show commitment to downstream visibility and product responsibility. Public institutions also need to commit to standards, enforcement, and coordination. Investors should commit to infrastructure that can be built, measured, and sustained. Department partners and development partners should commit to strengthening national systems. Market actors should remain central to this design because any system that ignores the market will fall in practice. Media and researchers must also take responsibility. The burden cannot be fueled by government alone. The fuller story must include the trade, the livelihoods, and the failures, the reforms and the responsibilities, especially those that cross borders. This is how Ghana, that gives you this platform, can also lead. Leadership does not mean carrying the burden alone. It means setting a disciplined table where every actor understands that the future of the secondary textile trade depends on fairness, on quality, on evidence, investment, and shared costs. This country welcomes legitimate trade. It welcomes serious partners. It welcomes responsible partners. It welcomes investment that builds capacity and protects livelihoods. A future where value is exported, responsibility is delayed, and cost is left behind cannot be the basis of a just secular economy. Every cleanup reminds us that damage has occurred somewhere. Every rejected bill reminds us that someone paid for failure. Every blocked drain, water body, reminds us that prevention is indeed cheaper than repair. Every unmanaged textile residue reminds us that the next generation will inherit what today's system refuses to solve. So let across send a message worthy of this moment. Responsible trade ought to be traceable. Shared responsibility should carry costs, data, and remedy. Circularity should be proven where products reach their final consequence. The task ahead is to protect legitimate commerce, strengthen public systems, finance recovery, support market livelihoods, and rebuild the infrastructure that prevents textile residues from becoming a permanent burden in our cities and, of course, a burden in our water bodies, in our environments, and you name it. Let that standard be the standard that develops right here in Ghana, in Accra. Let that partnership begin right here in Ghana, in Accra. Let us all strengthen the policies and regulations that fuel this conversation. Above all, let that work begin now. I thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for her. And if I can crave your indulgence, I'd like us to give her a standing ovation for such a wonderful speech. I believe she has now placed context in Ghana's direction when it comes to this particular topic. And one thing is clear is that accountability is no longer optional. Madam, I also like to crave your indulgence as you pay attention to the screen, and there's something for you on here. Please watch. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now invite the co-founders for Landfills to Landmarks, that's Samuel Jampo and Henry Triku. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause. Madam, would like to have you up here, please. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause.
There's nothing more to say. We all saw the video, so we are just going to unveil what we saw in the video. And we humbly present this to Madam Joyce for being a supportive board chair.
Wow, this is beautiful. Madam, do you have some few words for us?
Well, thank you very, very much. Very humbling. And what can I say? So much talent in one room. Let's make this talent count. Let's make it do something important for all of us. Let's let this actually put the conversation and reimagine what this conversation should look like when we meet again next year. Thank you all so much. I'm grateful.
Thank you very much, Madam. Now, this is the part where this room becomes part of the conversation. Earlier, I mentioned to you that if you have comments, if you have questions, contributions, jot them down, and we'll come to you. So this is the point where we bring the microphones down to you. So if you have any comments or contributions, you can make do with that. If you have a comment or contribution, can I see your hand up? And the ushers will come right to you. I want to have three people now, and then as the program continues, we would add the rest to it. Contributions, comments, questions. Can I see your hand, please? The ushers are the ladies in the black outfits. If you have some comments, some questions. I think the president of GUTA, I would want to start with you first, Mr. Clement Boateng. Another round of applause for him, please. Yes, sir. If you have a contribution, comment, this is Account Day.
Good morning to everyone here. I think it's such a great occasion that we have all assembled here, to deliberate on this very issue that we have been grappling with for some time now. We all know that this used clothing business is the preserve of some of Ghanaians, and we have close to over 2.5 million of people who are
into this business. And we are very much aware that some people are also lobbying behind for the banning of this, business. But let's look at the business which is taking care of over 2.5 million. Is it fair that people will be lobbying for the banning of this business? Is it fair? I'm asking all those that are in the room here, is it fair for this business to be banned? We all know that the private sector is the greatest employer of the people in Ghana here. Government cannot, and for that matter, the public sector cannot take care of the huge deficit of employment situation that we have in this country. Government employs only about 1 million in the public sector. So all the employment in this country here have been taken care of by the private sector. And if we have a sector that is creating jobs for over 2.5 million people, is it fair that people will lobby behind for the business to be banned? So what I will indulge you is, let's all put our weight behind this business. If there is something that we need to correct, let's rather do the correction, but rather talking about banning the business altogether. Because we all understand that in everything that you do, definitely there will be some challenges, there will be some problems that we need to, correct so that we can move ahead. So if we see that there is something which is not good about the business, and so therefore we need to correct it, let's all rally behind them and let's do the correction, but rather don't let us, talk bad about it. Because like Madam Mokhtari said, Madam Mokhtari is somebody that I have worked with over the years. When she was the head of Liga at the then Ghana Shippers Council, and I was also the national organizer of GUTA. She's a very affable woman, and I love, working with her. Let's listen to the speech that she delivered. Over the years, 20 years back at the campus of University of Ghana, people were, wearing this kind of clothing. And I can tell you, even our big men, they do wear this, but they don't go to Kantamanto. They will be in their houses, and then the goods will be, brought to them. So please, I beg, don't let us chastise them. Let us help them. If there is something that we need to correct, let us correct them so that their business will also boom in order to create more employment for the people of Ghana. Thank you.
So much, sir. We really appreciate those comments there. That was the president of GUTA, Clement Boateng. We continue with the program now, and we welcome our special guest of honor, Helen Nellis. Today, her address will focus on civic leadership, fairness in narratives, shared responsibility, and the importance of downstream voices within global discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, warmly welcome Madam Helen Nellis.
Akwaba. Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. It's a real privilege and a responsibility to stand before you and with you today as the patron of a UK charity, the Hospice Keach Hospice, but also, and possibly more importantly, as someone learning more about a cause that connects communities across continents. My connection to Ghana is not recent, nor is it abstract. It spans more than 50 years, beginning in the mid-70s when my husband, Professor Joe Nellis, who's here today, taught at St Paul's School in Denu. What began as a chapter of exploration became something far more enduring. Over the decades, we have built deep and lasting friendships, and Ghana has come to feel like our second home. I'm especially honoured today to be accompanied by one of those long-standing dear friends, Dr. Sylvanus Vortier, who is working tirelessly to improve lives in Ghana. His presence here today is a reminder that this work is not about distant problems. It is about people we know, communities we care about, and futures we are all invested in. Dr. Vortier's leadership as Chief Exec of Axon Ghana has been marked by a clear commitment to harnessing technology for practical, locally relevant impact in Africa. Under his guidance, Axon has grown as a proudly Ghanaian software development company, building innovative digital solutions that help businesses and organizations work more effectively and sustainably. He's championed the use of technology not simply as an end in itself, but as a tool for improving systems, strengthening accountability, and creating opportunities. By fostering a culture of expertise, continuous learning, and collaboration, he is helping to position Ghana as a place of innovation and capability, while also ensuring that technological progress translates into real benefits for communities and everyday lives. We're gathered here at this summit to share knowledge, to inspire action, and action is the key word, and to confront difficult truths. One of those truths is this: the global trade in used clothing, often framed as charitable or sustainable, is in some cases neither, and nowhere is this more visible than here in Ghana. Ghana has long been a hub for second-hand clothing, receiving millions of garments, as we've heard, each week from countries like the United Kingdom. These clothes arrive with the promise of reuse, of extended life, of circular economy ideals. And indeed, some are resold, reused, and valued. But a significant proportion may be deemed unsellable upon arrival for various reasons. Some of those items are discarded, ending up in open dumps, waterways, and informal landfill sites. And it's been really inspiring this morning to hear speakers such as yourself, Madam, and those who've gone before, describing the real impact on this beautiful country. This is where the work of landfill to landmarks becomes so important and so powerful. For what I see, landfills to landmarks is not simply an environmental initiative. It is a systems intervention. It challenges the narrative that responsibility ends at donation. It asks us to look beyond intention and to examine impact. One of the most innovative aspects of their work is the use of tracing software. As we know, allows garments to be tracked beyond the point of donation from charity shops through export into their final destination. For the first time, we can begin to quantify and visualize the journey of clothing waste in a meaningful way. Why does this matter? Because what we cannot see, we cannot change. Tracing creates accountability. It gives policymakers evidence. It provides charities and retailers with data that challenges assumptions. And perhaps, most importantly, it gives voice to the communities in Ghana who are living with the consequences of excess. Before I go further, I want to reflect briefly on the organisation of which I am patron in the UK, Keach Hospice, and why its values are so relevant to this conversation. Keach Hospice supports adults and children with life-limiting conditions, as well as their families, providing compassionate, holistic care through some of the most challenging moments of life. At its heart is a commitment to dignity, respect, and seeing the whole person, not just their immediate need, but their wider context, their family, and the future. That same ethos compels us to think beyond the immediate acts of giving and to consider the longer-term impact of our actions. Compassion is not only about intention, it is about responsibility, accountability, and care for the wider world which we are all a part of. Keach Hospice, in its desire to participate more fully in understanding the journey of its donation, partners with SAIT Recycling in the UK. We chose to partner with SAIT because they stand as a practical example of how innovative waste management can transform environmental challenges into economic opportunities. By focusing on efficient material recovery, responsible processing, and community engagement, the company demonstrates that recycling is not just about reducing landfill use, but about creating sustainable value chains. Its approach integrates modern technology with a commitment to circular economy principles, ensuring that waste is repurposed into useful resources rather than discarded. In these partnerships, SAIT typically pays charities for the materials it collects, creating an immediate income stream while removing the burden of disposing of unsold or unusable donations. The collected items are then carefully sorted. High-quality pieces are reused or resold, with lower-grade textiles being recycled into new fibres, ensuring that minimal waste goes into landfill. Beyond collections, the company also collaborates on broader sustainability initiatives, which focus on improving transparency and traceability in the textile value chain. They work closely here with Landfills to Landmarks, sharing their goals of waste reduction and circular economy innovation, turning donated textiles into both social value and sustainable resources. But technology alone is not the solution. What makes Landfills to Landmarks' approach truly transformative is its commitment to local initiatives with solutions designed with, not for, the communities most affected. Across Ghana, as we've heard, there is an emergence of grassroots enterprises that are reclaiming waste and reimagining its value. It was just beautiful to see that lovely picture that was made and presented to Madam. From textile upcycling workshops to community-led recycling hubs, these initiatives are not only reducing landfill, they're creating livelihoods, fostering creativity and restoring dignity. One prime example of how looking at the challenges differently can positively impact local communities is the Pure Pad project. It's a powerful example of how environmental innovation and social impact can work hand in hand. Developed through the Landfill to Landmarks initiative, it transforms textile waste, materials that might otherwise land up in landfill, into affordable, reusable menstrual pads produced by women-led community enterprises across Ghana. This approach not only reduces textile waste, but also tackles period poverty, enabling thousands of girls to stay in school with dignity and confidence. At the same time, it creates local jobs, builds skills, and supports small-scale businesses, demonstrating that circular economy solutions can deliver real and lasting benefits for communities. In doing so, the PurePad project embodies a simple but transformative idea that what we discard can become a resource for opportunity, empowerment, and change. So this is not about charity, it's about partnership. In my previous role as the late Queen's representative in the UK, I was a supporter of over 30 charities through the years. I am acutely aware of the values that underpin care: compassion, respect, and responsibilities. These values do not stop at our borders. They extend into how we live, how we consume, and how we dispose. In the UK, donating clothing is often seen as an act of kindness, and it can be. But we must also acknowledge that our systems are overwhelmed. Fast fashion has dramatically increased the volume of textiles in circulation far beyond what can responsibly be managed through donation alone. We must begin to ask harder questions. Do we need to buy as much as we do? Are we donating responsibly or simply transferring the problem somewhere else? And how can we support systems that prioritise reduction, not just redistribution? Landfills to landmarks approach offers us a possible pathway forward. Through tracing, it can provide transparency. Through local engagement, it can build resilience. Through advocacy, it can challenge global systems that are no longer fit for purpose. But this work cannot be done in isolation. It requires collaboration between governments, charities, businesses, and communities. It requires investment, not just financial, but intellectual and moral. And it requires a shift in mindset from convenience to accountability. For those of us in the UK and other exporting countries, there is a clear role to play. We can support better regulation of textile exports. We can do better in sorting and recycling infrastructure at home. We can educate donors about what is truly reusable. And we can partner with organisations like Landfills to Landmarks to ensure that solutions are informed by those on the front line. And for all of us here today, there is an opportunity and an obligation to act. Imagine a system where clothing is designed with its end of life in mind, where waste is minimised at source, not managed at destination, where communities are empowered, not burdened, where transparency replaces assumption. This is not an abstract vision. It is already beginning to take shape through initiatives like Landfill to Landmarks. But it will only succeed if we scale it, if we support it, and if we stand behind it. It will not be done in 5 minutes. We will need to be resilient. We will need to be in this for the long term. In closing, I'd like to return to the idea of connection. The clothes we wear connect us culturally, economically, and environmentally to people we may never meet. The choices we make in one country can have profound consequences in another. Let us ensure that these connections are grounded in fairness, responsibility and respect. Let us move from landfill to landmarks, not just in Ghana, but globally. I want to end by paraphrasing part of a beautiful poem of hope and aspiration written by Amanda Gorman called The Hill We Climb. So let us leave behind a world better than the one we were left. With every breath, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. In every known nook of our nations, in every corner of our world, our peoples, diverse and beautiful, will emerge, battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it. Medase.
Madam Yadasis. Let us move from landfills to landmarks, she says. Thank you so much, Madam Lord Lieutenant Helen Nellis. We'll now turn our attention to the evidences emerging directly from the Trace Day. We're going to be looking at all the evidences, all the conversations we had yesterday. We're bringing them here to now account for those conversations. And in order to do that, I'll now invite Samuel Jampo, who is the co-founder for Landfills to Landmarks. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for him, please.
Good morning. I'll seek permission to stand on existing protocols just to go straight into the conversation. So unfortunately, yesterday, many of us didn't get a chance to see the live bill labs. So first of all, I'd like to close the gap to give you insight as to what happened yesterday. So there were 5 bills that were positioned by 5 retailers. 2 of the bills came from the United Kingdom, 1 from England and then another one from Scotland. Then we had 1 bill from Canada, then we had 1 bill from Holland and then another bill from China. So these were 5 bills. Maybe these guys brought their best foot forward. So where the objective here is to look at what were the unsellable items within these bills to sort of shape the proper narrative around the waste fractions that are within the bills. It's interesting to know that sometime in 2024, there has been an internet footprint that has recorded that 40% of the content of the bills that we receive in Ghana are waste. Now, if you Google anything around textile waste, you come across this figure registered on the internet. So, as an industry, we need to present the evidence and present the actual situation on ground. So that is what our work sort of represents, because every industry must present its own data. As a telecommunication engineer over the past 25 years, the telecom industry can tell you how many voice calls were made, when they were made, where cost drops were done, the volume of internet consumed. The industry can tell you. If they don't rely on research to report on what happens in a trade. So between myself and Henry, we said, let's bring this technology into an informal trade so that the trade can report its own data. The trade can report its own challenges so that policymakers will have insights to provide the needed intervention. So these 5 bills here represent just 5 retailers. Imagine we have onboarded the 2.5 million retailers on this system. Imagine the insights we can collect. Imagine the truth we can discover so that we don't have to go into a subjective conversation around 40% waste or whatever. We just go into the system to make that decision. That data could also tell policymakers that indeed 2.5 million people rely on this trade. So in that reason, it helps shape the right policies. So yes, yesterday, these 5 bills, we had Bill 1 for, in the interest of not disclosing the origin of the bills, we just anonymize them and just call them Bill 1 to Bill 5. So we have some return items which ideally can't be sold. So we call them the unsellable items. And then they themselves, through the sorting, realize what is sellable. So the fractions are quite high. The usable fractions are quite high. I think the lowest there is around 97%, and the highest there is around 98%. It's still not a perfect situation. The country said by the Ghana Youth Clothing Association positioned the waste fraction at 5%. But yesterday, this is what we realized. Again, possibly these guys brought their best foot forward, but when we scale this tool across the market, we can discover what the real situation is in the market. So the question is, what are the key policy interventions that can come out of here? So number one is, what should be the acceptable waste fraction that we should tolerate as a country, as an importing country? And this is something that through the policy engagement, we'll have to agree on. In an initial policy discussion that we had between Ghana's EPA and UK's environmental agency, they sort of agree on a 10% as the tolerable waste fraction that should be in the bill. And anything above 10% should be reported as an infraction, and the exporters should receive sanctions for bringing this waste fraction in. Now, this also sets the tone around what should be classified as waste fraction. It also leads to the conversation around what is acceptable acceptance criteria to establish that criteria of waste fraction. So these are issues that need to be defined, because without those definitions, we leave a lot of these things to multiple interpretation, which won't help a progressive conversation, which won't help this trade to move forward. So these are things that policymakers will lead a discussion on. Ghana Standard Authority is looking at this with other state agencies like the Ministry of Local Government and EPA to define these parameters. The President of GUTA mentioned something about livelihoods. Now, to support that, we need this insight. We need this national data infrastructure to guide the right policies to be made. Now, moving on, we looked at where the return fractions are. But we also want to fast forward to look at what happens to those return fractions. What do we do with them? And these return fractions are looking at it from the market recovery stage. So we had a scanning equipment proudly donated to us by the TRI group. Please give them a round of applause for helping us with that scanning equipment. So this scanning equipment scans the return items, which is not wearable, which is not usable, so that we can define the end-of-life pathways for those elements. And yesterday, we had 4 garments that were not sellable, and we scanned those 4 garments. And we realized that 2 of those garments had 50% polyester. One had polyester and was also contaminated with other stains in there. And then the 4th one was 25% nylon. Now, these statistics here will indicate what the end-of-life pathway should be. So, for example, for polyester, it's a good candidate for RDF, which has a higher calorific value. So if you have this understanding, you can now divert these garments to those particular end-of-life garments. Now, if we want to discuss recycling, we also need to have insight on the levels of feedstock. Again, we need data to advise on what is the level of feedstock required, because no sensible investor would come and invest if they don't have insights around what the feedstock levels are. So this infrastructure is so key to advance the conversation about the right investment needed in the various end-of-life pathways. And of course, we know upcyclers are in the ecosystem, but they don't address the bigger scale of recycling issues and address the end-of-life pathways that we have. We went into the other bills and discovered all of these things. So I just want to sum up here and say, we will get into the policy discussion, but this becomes our eyes. A lot of conversation has happened earlier on around the importance of traceability. We have done our bit. This is self-funded. It's been supported by the BHF. TRI have supported this. But through meeting with Lord Lieutenant retired Helen Ellis, she has introduced us to CEO of Axon, who has committed to support this work, to scale it to an international level. And I'm happy to also announce that because of this initial trial that we started with TRI, who is the largest UK exporter into Ghana, they have voluntarily decided to be on this platform, and since January, we've been reporting their exports into Ghana. Also, Marvin or Mark are also the biggest importers in Ghana. They're also on this platform with their retailers, and we've been recording the waste fractions, the return items that is coming through, and feedback is being shared. So we understand from the biggest exporter and importer what the dynamics are. But to make this thing work, we need to scale it across the market and get everybody involved in this. And EPA, we are working with EPA through our MOU to get the trade sort of registered and formalized so that we can advance the conversation. We are happy to get everybody on board and whatever support that you can give us to advance this work for us to get to where we need to be. Thank you for your attention.
Well, you would agree with me that these evidences are quite wild, and I believe it needs some enforcement lenses. And before we put those lenses on, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of some very important persons again in our midst. We have the Member of Parliament for Clapham and Brixton Hill in the United Kingdom, Madame Belle Ribeiro Adi. You're so much welcome. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, our headline sponsor, TRI. You are so much welcome. Thank you so much for all you do. With the TRI CEO being Michael Oye, our gold sponsor, Side Recycling. The CEO of Side Recycling is Jonathan Sides. The CEO for Clyde Recycling is Owen Ritchie. CEO of PANA, Powell Kowalski, and a bronze sponsor, Tradeway. We can now hear from Ghana's environmental direction and the type of regulation that can be checked in practice. Joining us live virtually is the EPA regulatory keynote speaker, which is Professor Nana Ama Brown Kluche. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to her.
Distinguished ministers and government officials, the Honorable Chair and members of the Governing Board of Landfills to Landmarks, traditional leaders, development partners, industry leaders, representatives from global brand and retailers, exporters and importers, members of the diplomatic community, colleagues and regulatory institutions, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This summit comes at an important moment for global textile accountability. It is a privilege to join you, although not physically, at the Landfill to Landmarks Global Summit 2026 under the theme Trace, Account, Rebuild. Although I'm not there physically in Accra today due to official commitments, I felt it was important to share these remarks because the conversations taking place here are both nationally significant and increasingly relevant globally. Before today's plenary section, I understand that yesterday's town hall brought together traders, market leaders, coastal communities, recyclers, informal sector actors, development partners, and upstream industry participants. I commend Landfill to Landmark for creating space for these voices. Too often, global sustainability conversations do not adequately reflect the realities faced by those working within downstream markets. What came through clearly from the town hall is that textile accountability is not an abstract issue, it is part of everyday life. It is seen in the challenges faced by traders, the pressure on communities managing waste, and the work of informal actors who recover and repurpose materials under difficult conditions. These realities must inform how systems are designed going forward. It is important that upstream actors are part of these discussions Effective solutions depend on engagement across the full value chain. The value of the town hall lies in bringing these perspectives together and recognizing that workable systems must reflect real conditions on the ground. Across the world, regulators are redefining and redesigning how textiles are produced, traced, tracked, and managed. In the European Union, there is movement towards extended producer responsibility, digital product passports, tighter controls on waste exports, and rules that prevent the destruction of unsold textiles. These developments point in one direction: stronger accountability across the value chain. They also affect what reaches downstream markets, such as the markets we have in Ghana. The effectiveness of these policies will ultimately depend on how they work in practice, particularly in markets where products are reused and where waste is managed. We can no longer speak about fashion without addressing responsibilities. We can no longer look at exports without considering outcomes. We can no longer separate trade from accountability. Ghana plays an important role in this system. Our markets are major destinations within the global used clothing trade. They support livelihoods and provide access to affordable clothing. At the same time, pressures are increasing. Growing volumes of low-quality textiles are entering downstream markets, including materials that cannot be reused, such as blended fabrics, non-textile components, and contaminated items. The issue is not only that these materials exist, it is that they are not consistently measured. Effective regulation depends on being able to quantify what is entering the system and what happens to them. This requires classification at import, verification of material composition, and tracking through markets to end-of-life outcomes. This provides clarity on what can be reused, what can be recovered, and what becomes waste. Without this level of measurement, waste remains unquantified, responsibility remains unclear, and regulation cannot be effectively applied. These effects are already visible with waste accumulation in communities, open dumping and burning, blocked drainage systems and flooding, increased pressure on local authorities and informal operators, rising costs of managing waste. This points to a structural imbalance. This is where value is created upstream while the burden of managing waste is carried downstream. The situation can no longer continue. There must be a change. The Environmental Protection Act 2025, Act 1124, provides the framework to address this. It gives the authority the responsibility to regulate, to coordinate and enforce environmental management, while supporting resource efficiency and extended producer responsibility. This allows Ghana not only to respond to global changes, but to implement systems that reflect local realities. So we need to trace. Traceability is now a requirement. It's no longer optional. Without visibility, accountability cannot be enforced. Most traceability systems focus on production and exports. They do not extend into downstream markets. This is where improvements are needed and we need to be focused. Better systems are required to understand what enters the market and what happens to it. This includes classification, inspection, verification, and tracking beyond the point of import. Landfill to Landmarks has developed a downstream traceability system that supports this work. This system provides the data needed to understand material flows, asset outcomes, and supports regulatory decisions. It supports classification, measurement of reuse and waste, and the design of extended producer responsibility systems. The Environmental Protection Authority has entered into a memorandum of understanding with Landfill to Landmarks to support this work. Implementation is underway. The work is ongoing to develop a national textile producer baseline, which will provide a clear view of producers and materials flow. This includes data collection across importers of used and new garments, local garment manufacturers, export flows into the Ghanaian market. A project implementation committee is in place to coordinate this. This moves the process from planning into execution. These systems form the basis of effective regulation. If we cannot see what is happening, we cannot regulate it. That's why we need to be accountable. Responsibility must follow the movement of the product. As textiles move across borders, responsibility must move with them. Extended producer responsibility provides a way to structure this. Ghana is advancing the extended producer responsibility framework for textiles under Act 1124. This will require producers and importers to contribute to waste management. It will link compliance to market activities and support investment in recovery and recycling. Responsibility will be shared across the value chain. Exporters, producers, and importers will all have defined rules. Effective implementation depends on alignment between export standards, import controls, and waste management system. Data from traceability systems will support this by identifying participants, measuring flows, and monitoring compliance. Then the system can be rebuilt. The system is being reshaped. Responsibility, value, accountability are being recognized. This requires practical systems that reflect how markets actually function. Informal actors are part of the system and must be considered in its design. In Ghana, work is ongoing to strengthen regulation, develop EPR system, and support traceability and recovery infrastructure. And these elements are connected because data supports policy. Policy will define responsibility. Responsibility supports financing. Financing enables infrastructure, and financing must be sustained. It cannot depend on one-off support. It has to be sustainable. It must be built on the economic structure of the system, and the system must fund itself through the structure of the market. This is the only way to ensure long-term results and sustainability. Progress must match the scale of the challenge. So discussion must lead to action. Clear regulatory frameworks, functional systems, investment decisions, measurable outcomes. I'm happy to say that Ghana is committed to building systems that work in practice and can be sustained over time. And the direction is clear. Accountability must cover the full responsibility and the full value chain. Downstream markets are part of that system. The time for fragmented approaches has passed. Accountability must be structured. Progress depends on execution. The focus now is on building systems that deliver results. The work has already begun. Together, the let us trace. Together, let us account. Together, let us rebuild. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Nana Ama Brown Klucher. She is EPA's boss. With that being said, we'll now move into exporter discipline, trade trust, traceability, as she said, and also shared accountability. Ladies and gentlemen, join me. Welcome Peter Page from the Textile Recycling International for the TRI Group keynotes.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you to Landfills to Landmarks team, the government representatives, regulators, traders, recyclers and industry leaders gathered here today. And honestly, there is no better place to have this conversation than right here in Ghana. Because here, the impact of the global second-hand clothing trade is not just theoretical, it is visible every day in markets, in livelihoods, in communities, and unfortunately sometimes along coastlines as well. And that truly matters. And that is exactly why TRI chose to headline sponsor Landfills to Landmarks 2026 Summit. Not because we believe the industry is perfect, but because we believe the future of second-hand clothing trade depends on transparency, accountability, shared responsibility, and most importantly, credible evidence. Now, while I'm speaking today, hopefully, you will see the Bail Index dashboard visuals behind me on screen. And honestly, the dashboard is the real reason and the real story I want to talk to you about today. Because for years, this industry has operated through assumptions, headlines, accusations, and fragmented statistics. Some people defend the trade completely, others condemn it. But neither side can move the industry forward without credible data. And that is exactly what this pilot was designed to address. What you are seeing on the screen is not a concept project. Working with one major importer and 20 independent retailers, TRI fully traced more than 1.2 million kilograms of good quality second-hand clothing shipped from the UK to Ghana. And importantly, all of that data being shown has been independently verified by a third-party verification partner. And that point is critical. Because if we want governments to trust the industry, if we want regulators to introduce fair standards, and if we want responsible businesses to distinguish themselves from irresponsible operators, then the data must stand up to scrutiny. And for the first time, we are beginning to create that level of accountability. Now, one of the most important things in this dashboard was visibility at bail level and also retailer level. Historically, once the bail left the importer, visibility disappeared. But through this pilot, we could begin identifying which bail grades sold the fastest, which products were slow movers, and which categories performed best in different markets, and even how individual retailers performed across different product streams. That level of downstream visibility is transformational, because suddenly we're no longer debating assumptions. We are analysing measurable commercial outcomes. And as part of the pilot, we also introduced a retailer take-back scheme. The retailers could return garments that were unsellable and receive a credit back into the system. That changes accountability completely, because the responsibility no longer stops at export. Returned garments were then inspected and categorised and analysed using Matoa infrared fibre scanning technology, as Samuel had announced earlier. That allows us to identify fibre composition, including cotton, polyester and blended materials. Once identified, recycling fibres could be then segregated and directed into recycling streams. Other materials unsuitable for current recycling technologies were directed towards energy recovery through incineration, ensuring they do not end up in landfill or on beaches. And now we come to the statistic that I believe really changes the conversation. Across this 4-month pilot, more than 107,000 garments were successfully sold by participants and retailers, and only 103 garments were returned through the take-back scheme. Just 103. Just to repeat that, over 107 garments were sold, and only 103 garments came back through the take-back process. That is incredibly powerful data. Because for years, we have heard repeated narratives suggesting that 40% of imported second-hand clothing immediately becomes waste. But what this pilot demonstrates is that the reality may be far more nuanced than many of the public narratives suggest. Now, to be absolutely clear, we are not claiming this pilot represents the entire global trade. It does not. It is a snapshot of one importer, 20 retailers, 4 months. But what it does prove is something incredibly important. Traceability at scale is achievable. Commercial accountability is achievable. And verified downstream data collection is possible. And once you have credible data, you can start making better decisions. Better policy decisions, better investment decisions, and better environmental decisions. Because without credible, verified data, how can regulators fairly introduce standards across sorting quality, export procedures, import controls, or even environmental responsibility? How can responsible operators distinguish themselves from irresponsible ones? And how do we stop poorly sorted, low-quality products flooding the market and damaging the reputation of the wider trade? That is one of the biggest risks affecting this industry today, because the second-hand clothing trade absolutely has value. It supports livelihoods, it provides affordable clothing, it extends garment life, and it achieves and supports reuse over disposal. And across Ghana specifically, it supports traders, transport networks, repair businesses, market ecosystems, and thousands of families, probably millions of families. But to protect that value, responsible businesses must lead from the front. Responsible self-regulation is no longer optional. It is essential, and this pilot is only the beginning. The next phase is a full 12 months expansion across all 4 TRI group companies, involving additional importers, retailers, and market environments. Because the larger the data set becomes, the stronger the evidence becomes, and ultimately that evidence is how we establish traceability and accountability as standard across the industry. Now, alongside accountability, we also need investment. Investment in end-of-life solutions, investment in collection systems, and investment in fibre-to-fibre technologies. And investors increasingly require one thing before they commit capital: reliable, accountable data. That is why this work matters so much. Because if we can create transparent downstream visibility, we can begin directing investment to where the real burden actually exists. And that creates opportunity, not just environmental opportunity, economic opportunity as well. But none of this happens through denial, none of it happens through blame, and none of it happens through silence. It happens through responsible businesses, regulators, responsible exporters, importers, traders, and recyclers working together using credible shared difference. Because I genuinely believe the industry now stands at a crossroads. One path leads to environmental continued mistrust, fragmented regulation, and damaging narratives. The other path leads towards transparency, accountability, measurable standards, and long-term sustainability. And I believe the Bail Index dashboard behind me today represents the beginning of that second path. A move from opinion to evidence, from narrative to accountability, and ultimately from accountability to action. Thank you.
One phrase that continues returning throughout this particular summit is shared accountability and traceability. Now we'll be hearing from the rep from the Minister of State for Climate Change and Sustainability, Honourable Isifi, and this address is to be read by Ruth Jokoto. Ladies and gentlemen, with a round of applause, let's invite her.
Good afternoon. I bring warm regards from the Minister of State to you all. If you were in the conference last year, you will know that I love attention so much. So kindly give me your attention. Thank you. We have a lot of personalities in the room, so I'll beg to stand on existing protocols, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to address you today on behalf of the Honorable Minister, Isifu Seidu, at this Summit 2026, Landfills to Landmarks. The Minister extends warm regards and appreciation to the Board and Organizing Committee for convening yet another timely and globally significant summit here in Accra. We especially acknowledge the leadership of Chairperson Honorable Joyce Bawa Muktari and commend the growing coalition of local and international partners working to transform environmental ambition into measurable action. Last year, the summit challenged us to rethink the relationship between waste, production, and sustainability. This year, the conversation has evolved. We are no longer gathered merely to discuss the urgency of transition. We are here to operationalize it. The central question before us today is no longer whether sustainability matters. The question is whether our systems, markets, institutions, and policies are capable of delivering sustainability at scale with accountability, transparency, and measurable impact. Ladies and gentlemen, across the world, climate change is forcing nations to confront uncomfortable realities about how we produce, consume, trade, and dispose of materials. The environmental costs of linear economic systems are no longer abstract. They are visible in overflowing landfills, polluted waterways, degraded ecosystems, rising emissions, and increasing pressure on urban infrastructure. For Ghana, these realities are particularly evident within the textile and second-hand clothing sector. The second-hand textile economy supports thousands of livelihoods across our markets and communities. It contributes to trade, entrepreneurship, and household survival. Yet, it also exposes significant environmental and governance gaps. Large volumes of unusable textile waste continue to accumulate within our markets, drains, beaches, and landfill sites, often without structured systems for accountability, traceability, recovery, or circular reintegration. This is why this year's summit is so important. Landfills to Landmarks is helping to move the conversation from visibility to systems transformation. The introduction of initiatives such as the Live Bill Lab, as we just saw, and textile traceability demonstration reflects an important shift in climate governance, the shift from aspiration to implementation. Because sustainability without systems cannot deliver impact, implementation without data cannot deliver accountability. Ladies and gentlemen, Ghana recognizes that the future of climate governance systems. That is why the government, through the Office of the Minister of State for Climate Change and Sustainability, and in collaboration with key institutions, continues to advance a national vision anchored on circular economy principles, climate resilience, green industrialization, and sustainable production systems. Our emerging circular economy framework seeks to reposition waste not as environmental burden, but as economic resource capable of generating jobs, innovation, enterprise opportunities, and climate value. The transition requires structural reforms across multiple sectors. It requires us to design production systems to minimize waste generation from the outset. It requires strong extended producer responsibility mechanisms that ensure accountability across value chains. It requires investment in recycling infrastructure, digital traceability system, sustainable packaging alternative, climate-smart manufacturing, and environmentally responsible trade systems. Most importantly, it requires partnership. Government alone cannot achieve this transformation. We need stronger collaboration between policy and industry, between regulators and market actors, between innovators and financiers, between local communities and global development partners, and between Africa and the international community. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most critical issues emerging globally is the need for environmental accountability within international supply chains. Countries in the global south must not continue to bear disproportionate environmental burdens without corresponding systems for shared responsibility, sustainable financing, and transparent monitoring mechanisms. This is why traceability matters. Traceability strengthens environmental governance. It improves regulatory efficiency. It supports evidence-based policy making. It enhances investor confidence. And importantly, it creates pathways for measurable climate outcomes linked to carbon accounting, circularity indicators, and green finance assets. As global markets increasingly move towards sustainability and compliance frameworks, Ghana must position itself proactively, not reactively. We must build systems today that prepare our economy for the future of sustainable trade. Ladies and gentlemen, the transition to a circular economy also presents enormous opportunities for Ghana's young people. Across the country, young innovators are already leading transformative work in recycling, upcycling, sustainable fashion, green technology, digital innovation, and waste recovery enterprises. The future green economy will not simply create environmental benefits. It will create jobs, industries, and new economic possibilities. This is why government remains committed to supporting green entrepreneurship, climate innovation ecosystems, skills development, and youth-led sustainability enterprises. The vision is very clear. A Ghana where sustainability is not treated as a constraint to development, but as driver of inclusive growth, resilience, competitiveness, and national transformation. As we gather here with representatives from Europe, Asia, Australia, East Africa, and beyond, the summit reminds us that climate change is a shared challenge requiring shared responsibility. No country can solve the climate crisis alone. But equally, no country can afford to delay action. The decisions we make today about waste systems, production models, trade accountability, and circular infrastructure will shape the environmental and economic future of future generations to come. And so today, Ghana extends a call for deeper collaboration. We invite investors to support circular economy infrastructure. We invite innovators to co-create scalable solutions. We invite development partners to strengthen technical and financial cooperation. We invite industry leaders to embrace sustainable business models. And we invite all stakeholders to work collectively towards systems that are not only economically productive, but environmentally restorative and socially just. Ladies and gentlemen, the journey from landfills to landmarks is not a slogan at all. It is a development imperative, it is climate imperative, and above all, it is leadership imperative. Future generations will judge us not by the speeches we deliver, but by the systems we built, the partnerships we forged, and the courage we demonstrated in transforming environmental challenges into opportunities for sustainable progress. So on behalf of the Honorable Minister of State for Climate Change and Sustainability, I wish you a continuous, fruitful deliberation and a successful summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ruth Jokoto. Now to deliver our next policy address on receiving markets, safeguards and cross-border responsibility, please help me welcome Belle Ribeiro Adi, who is the Member of Parliament for Clapham and Brixton Hill. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Ribeiro Adi.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. Please permit me to stand on all existing protocols, especially as I have some other business to attend to today. But as you have heard others say already, there's something very fitting about having this conversation here in Accra, in a city that has become almost against its will the place where the global north's conscience goes to die, one bale of clothing at a time. Are still not moving fast enough, and what levers we need to pull to change that. Now, I represent Clapham and Brixton Hill, which is in South London. It is the very best constituency in the entire United Kingdom. You may hear other members of Parliament say the same, but I am obviously the only person telling the truth. And my constituency is home to some of the most entrepreneurial, community-minded people that I know. And it's also home to award-winning charity shops, clothes banks and textile collection points on almost every high street. People donate in good faith. They believe their unwanted clothes will find a second life, and very often they do. But the infrastructure that makes that possible, the sorting, the grading, the distribution, the markets that absorb what cannot be resold in the UK, that infrastructure is largely invisible to British consumers and, frankly, largely invisible to British policymakers. The journey ends in their minds at the donation bank. What happens next is someone else's problem. Except it's not someone else's problem. It's the problem of many of the people in the room. It's the problem of people in Accra because it lands here. Now let me start with the number we keep coming back to, because it still lands even in a room that already knows them. And that's 15 million garments a week. That is what arrives in Ghana. That's something that's been verified by the All Foundation, cited by CNN, the AFP, and researchers across the field. And of those 15 million items, approximately 40% arrive unsellable, not slightly worn or in need of a stitch, but complete trash, shipped as if it were a gift, and hearkening back to the colonial relationships of the past. And I understand that the Accra Metropolitan Assembly spends around $500,000 a year just collecting it. That's not an environmental statistic. That is money coming out of public services in a city that didn't create the problem and from which no revenue flows back. In most northern policy conversations, those numbers appear as a downstream consequence, a regrettable externality, and something that we should address eventually once the domestic framework is settled. And I want to suggest to you that this framing is in itself a problem, and that until receiving markets are built into policy design from the start, not bolted on at the end, we will keep producing frameworks that look circular on paper and are all linear in practice. So let me tell you where the UK actually is at the moment, because I think it's very important to be honest about that. The UK is the largest exporter of used clothing to Ghana, not one of the largest, but the largest, and that fact should be at the forefront of every conversation that we have in Westminster about textile sustainability, and I can tell you that largely it is not. So when British politicians and British brands talk about this circular economy, they are usually talking about what happens within our borders. The donation bank, the charity shop, the recycling target. They're not talking about what happens when the bale gets loaded onto a container ship, and they're not talking about Cantamanto. They're not talking about what we are discussing in this room. Extended producer responsibility as a concept is completely sound. The polluter pays, the producer takes responsibility for the end of life of their product. That's exactly the and every month that it does not, export continues to substitute for responsibility, ship it to the global south, job done, compliance technically intact. And that's not a circular economy, that's a linear economy and a longer conveyor belt. And we've seen what happens when that conveyor belt runs unchecked. The fire that swept through Cantamanto in January last year it was entirely predictable. When a market is handling millions of garments a week, largely absent, quality grade, almost entirely absent, and receiving markets have no visibility over what's coming. They cannot plan, they cannot prepare, and they can't make a credible case for financial support because there is no reliable evidence base. The brand audit data from Ghanaian beaches show that Marks & Spencer at nearly 15% of recovered waste, and Next at 12.5% is Gap. And that type of data is being used in Brussels. It needs to be used in Westminster too. But we should not have to get a beach. We should be getting it from the supply chain, source, legal requirement. Any serious framework must include mandatory export reporting that is volume, composition, quality grade and destination, and that data has to be shared with the receiving markets in real time, and it should be done not as a courtesy but as a core design requirement. Now the second is voice, and I want to be direct about this because I think politeness has sometimes obscured this particular point. Whilst I am personally delightful, as a backbench MP, I am not often required to be polite about policy, so I don't really understand it. But I note that when Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda and Tanzania moved to restrict low-quality textile imports, they were doing exactly what any responsible government would do when faced with an unmanaged, uncompensated waste flow crossing their borders. The international pushback they receive, trade pressure, warnings about of where power sits in this system and a warning to stay in their lane. That has to end. Accra is not downstream from this conversation, it's central to it. Receiving markets must be in the room when EPR schemes are designed, not invited to comment on a finished document, but at the table from the beginning, shaping its architecture. I know that in committee rooms, in Parliament, I've heard it in industry briefings, but policy moves when there is organised pressure, clear demand and political will. This conference, I believe, is part of building that pressure. Now, the third and final one is financing. Again, you've heard this before in terms of what's important. This is where some people in the global north policy circles get uncomfortable. So I want to make the case plainly. EPR means producers are responsible for the full life cycle of their products, the full life cycle, not the life cycle up to the point of export, not the life cycle within the jurisdiction, the full life cycle. If 40% of what arrives here is waste, and the cost of managing that waste falls entirely on traders, on local government, on communities in Accra, then the EPR principle is being performed and not applied. The mechanism for changing that is negotiable. It could be a levy on textile exports, ring-fenced to fund waste management capacity in receiving markets. It could be bilateral or multilateral revenue sharing between governments. It could be industry-led schemes where brands supplying into second-hand export chains contribute to the cost of managing unsellable products. I want to say something as well about the political climate, because I think it matters, again, to name it honestly. There are voices in British politics right now who would frame this entire conversation as an imposition, who would argue that our obligation ends at the borders and that, these countries in the global south should manage their own problems in this regard. And I reject that framing, not just as a matter of values, but as a matter of accuracy. Britain's consumption and the consumption of other countries in the global north created this problem. It was British brands producing at scale, externalising every possible cost, including the cost of disposal, that created this problem. Suggesting that the responsibility ends at the point of export is not a principled position. It's actually a convenient one. And I say this also as a matter of hard-headed policy. A global textile system that is visibly measurably unjust is not a stable system. Markets being used as uncompensated dumping grounds will eventually close their doors. Several have already started to, and they are right to do so. We are far better served building fair partnerships now than waiting until those partnerships are forced upon us. So I'm going to end where I began, or close to where I began. The UK is the largest exporter of used clothing to Ghana. That's not a neutral fact, it is a relationship. And relationships come with responsibilities. Britain is at an early stage in getting its textile policy right. We have the opportunity to, right now, at this moment, to design something that I believe will be genuinely circular, something that shares responsibility fairly, something that treats the full geography of the textile life cycle as a policy concern, not just at the comfortable domestic part of it. Many of the people in this room have been carrying this responsibility alone for too long. The producing countries, the brands, the consumers, the regulators, they really do need to pick up too. And they will not do so voluntarily, it seems. They will do so when the political and financial cost of not doing so becomes higher than the cost of change. So, for individuals like myself, the job is to go back to Westminster and make sure that that cost goes up. The